Greetings, welcome to Powered by Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Gracie Kunadu. On this episode, we're going to focus on studying African religion, or African spiritualities, I prefer. When I was in college, I began studying African religion, as it were called, and kind of ratcheted up my study when I was a graduate student at Cornell University. There, I found the Africana Center, and I found a person who was now an ancestor named of Dr. James Turner. May his soul rest in peace. That man has meant a tremendous amount of equity to me in my soul and to thousands of other students that he taught over the years. So big shout out, Dr. Turner. I'll come back to another episode in terms of a tribute from me to him. For now, what I want to zero in on what we've gotten wrong about the study of African religions or African spiritualities, whichever one you prefer. So here is how I came to that study and what I found in going through the muck that was the study of African religion in the 1960s and up until the 1990s, when essentially much of what was studied between that 30-year period between the 60s and the 90s became the foundation, sort of classical work for later studies. And so it's important, therefore, to look at the foundational work upon which others have either adopted, wholesale copied, even plagiarized, or remix for a more contemporary current audience. And so some of the important classical work that I came upon and that still stand as sort of classical work, within the study of African religions in rabbit ears or quotation, is of course the work of John Mbiti. And many of you who have actually either studied or plan to study, it's unmistakable that you'll come across this text either in a college course or somewhere in a bookstore or online. His introduction to African religion, his book on God in Africa, and his other work on African religion and philosophy became sort of the major body of work that others began to utilize and take wholesale. And not only you had others, take the Yoruba writer, E. Baloji Idowu, whose text on traditional African religion, as he called it, or the work of Jeffrey Parender on African religions, as well as other works that came later on that would challenge those classical writers. For example, Okat Peter Beck, the poet and writer from Uganda, whose classic work is not about religion, but is a classical work into literature called The Song of Okal, the Song of Lowino. Then you have also, most recently, the Ghanaian philosopher who recently passed away, a colleague of mine, who I spoke to a few times. His name is Kwesi Wiredu, one of the greatest African philosophers of the 20th century. And so the last two, that is Oka Peter Beck and Kwesi Wiredu, I'll talk about them later because they actually begin to criticize some of the classical work. So John Mbiti and others began to essentially use their own Christian training, their own Christian practice, their own Christian approach to what they refer to as African religion and traditional African religion. And this is one of the earlier missteps, conceptual errors, right, flaws of the earlier works from the late 50s and early 60s into the 70s and 80s, following the work of John Mbiti, because others take on his framework, they take on the way he sees things, his approach, his categories. And so between 1960s and 1990s, if you do like a Google Ngram search where you can search keywords and see how much they appear in literature over time, you get sort of like an S-wave. You see that words like ancestor cult and idol worship, shamanism, animism, fetishism, idolatry, right, primitive religion, all of these catch terms explode during that 30-year period, that 3-decade period. And it's not surprising because that's also when the academic study of African people and Africa, the continent, also emerges within European and North American universities. And so, for example, around the time of the push for what was then called Black Studies, later called Africana Studies, in the 1960s, there was also the emergence of African studies as an academic, field or academic discipline for some that began to emerge. So it is not surprising that there is both African studies as a serious enterprise within the U.S. and European Academy or universities and colleges begin to take off with the study of African religion at the same time, and both begin to what? Influence each other. And so people in African studies began to, of course, take at wholesale John Mbiti's work and those who followed in his footsteps. And likewise, those that came after Mbiti, they began to also popularize and mainstream much of his and his colleagues' work. The problem with the work that he and others did is that the categories did not belong to the people which they studied. First of all, no one can do a continental view of African religion because there is no continental African religion, first of all. That's a fiction, right? It's like doing a study of, the ocean in the world when there are, several bodies of water that are distinct but all connected. And so no one does an ocean view, of the world because it's too vast, too large, and too diverse. Even though there are connections and commonalities. And so, likewise, there is no continental African view or African religion, religious view, I would say. And so that's the first flaw. The second flaw within Mbiti and others is that they began to, use these concepts, like cult, like ancestor worship, like animism, as if Africans worship, things and rocks and the like. And essentially, that conceptual flaw plays into the idea that Africans are inherently, primitive, that they're inherently all about, everything boils down in African societies to witchcraft, which was the exact words of a very well-known anthropologist when it comes to African societies. And so this is the influence of Mbiti and his colleagues' work from the 60s onward. But the greatest, in my estimation, the greatest, error and mistake and longest lasting impact is this. It is the idea that Africans don't have a God or God concept in the sense that all they have is some aloof and distant and almost, foreign supreme being or entity that they have no connection with. And if you look through all the literature, either on specific African cultures like the Akan peoples or the Yoruba peoples or the Bakongo peoples or other kinds of African peoples, right? Throughout Western Africa, West Central Africa, Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, and Northern Africa, if you look at all these regions and you look at all these works that have been done on so-called traditional African religion or African religion, as a category, you will see that in all the cosmologies that were recorded and peddled since then, there is this common theme of an aloof, distance, and creative being or supreme being that has no relation, no connection, no involvement, no direct relation to human beings in terms of their lived experience in daily lives. And I dare you, in fact, I double dare you to find, work that actually don't essentially pin on that. Even a person like Robert Rattray, who studied the Asante people in the early 20th century, and he, in fact, learned the Asante language. And so he was, in fact, ahead of his time in terms of a European who mastered the Akan Chi language, in this case, the Asante variant. Even he fell into the same trap, right? And so there is only two answers to that. One, either African peoples writ large don't have a God concept in which that creative force of supreme being is not directly involved in human affairs across the entire continent, which to me seems too ridiculous and too essentially uniform, right, amongst a mixture of distinct but overlapping and diverse peoples in a wide geography of almost 2 billion people, right? At least 1.5 billion people today, the African continent. That to me seems too outrageous to have, this singular theme run across all these people. Or the other answer is that indeed they have their own God concept that looks differently, among different people, and which did not fit into the Christian idea of this singular God. And therefore, we have another problem. The problem is polytheism, the idea that there are multiple gods, right? Which again comes from MBT's and others' work. Now, let me clarify, and then I'm going to sort of boil things down and begin to wrap up, this sort of initial conversation about the study of African religion, and we pick back up next time. And so, in those important errors, in those important mistakes made by the likes of Mbiti, Idowu, Parinder, and many others, Alexis Kagame, studied the Bakongo people, so many others, that first generation of African studies and African religion being studied at the same time. Among those three major mistakes, the last one is for me the most important, because what it does then, it sets up the idea that that Africans don't have their own, what we may call God concept, right? B, that therefore Africans had to be introduced to the idea of God. And C, that idea of God had to come from what? European colonists, right? That's the logical link, if you follow Mbiti's work and those that came after him and those who were influenced by him. Of course, I think that logical link, is flawed. But more importantly, those categories set up many of us today. And so I've had discussions with people. I don't do it really online because I tried that once on Facebook and things didn't work out well in terms of having a civil discussion. So when I do have discussions with folks, they come with those categories, right? Even people who are or claim to be practitioners of African traditional religions or indigenous spiritualities, they still utilize those same categories and concepts. And it's amazing to me because the way in which they approach, African spiritualities, they do it in the same way that Mbiti approached, what he called and classified African religions. That is, there's some aloof, indirect God. And so, for example, among the Akan people, right, which, there's various terms for the supreme being or God, which is on Nyame, on Chudyampong, and some will argue that, like Kwesi, that, the Christian notion of God and the Akan notion of God or the creative force, are two different things. And there are some conceptual differences without any doubt. But what I wanted to push back on Rieru, and he's not here to defend himself, so I do this with some grace to him, push back on him is because, there's a difference between God, that is the God of all gods, right? All divinities, all spiritual beings, entities in existence, right? Cosmos, and the European iteration and version of God. There's a difference between the two, right? Because as I share with you other videos, I've had my own personal experiences and encounters with God, which I refer to as Father God, because he speaks to me like a father, right? And so, and I claim that God is my own, because, what I have seen, and that God looks like me, right? That God is African, and that makes sense because the first people on this planet, are African. The first peoples, archaeologically, anthropologically, and other linguistic evidence that point to one place, which is Africa. And specific regions there, it makes sense that, the God of all gods, of all divinities, right, would in fact, essentially be God. And if God, in fact, created human beings in its image, then certainly, that image would be that. And if the first human beings, are African, then it follows that God would be African. It's simple. But what has happened is that, over the last several hundred years, right, what has happened is that the idea of God has been not only colonized, but it has been flipped on its head. And so when we see these images and iconographies of a Europeanized or phenotypical European, quote unquote, white, Jesus, and therefore the supposition that God must be white too, and everything else is white. The spirits or angels, whatever, they're all white. Those things are the kinds of categories and imagery that baked into Mbiti's and other people's work. And therefore they, meaning Mbiti and his colleagues and those who follow in their footsteps, could not do any better when it came to trying to study African religion or African spiritualities, as I prefer. And so in the next video, I'm going to share with you an approach, right, that I've used to study African spirituality that I think will be of value to us and move us away from those categories and move us away from those trappings and move us towards something that I think will be much more nutritious, much more equitable, and much more sensible when it comes to studying African spiritualities or African religions, as it was called. For Baba Nyame, I've been your guide and host. Until next time, stay well. Drop your comments and questions below. Until then, take care.